What's up, everybody? It's the Tabletop Tyrant, and we're here for part 3 of Tamurkhan. Let's just dive into it because it's good. We left off with Tamurkhan and his horde being flooded out and having to change the course of their direction to head down an old and long-forgotten dwarven pass known as Winter's Teeth Pass. His vanguard of marauder horsemen had sent word back about some night goblin resistance, however there had been less and less reports. Tamurkhan had assumed that was because there was nothing to report. Eventually, Tamurkhan would make his way into the pass with his enormous horde, and there he would see bodies either hung by their neck or by their feet. There were also recent campfires where the remains of horses and human bones would be found, with distinct marks etched upon them, made by either teeth or weapon. Tamurkhan now had an idea of what happened to his vanguard. He smiled. Foul little creatures, he thought to himself. Tamurkhan was not taken aback by this. He was way too focused on the Throne of Chaos, which was right in his grasp. As the rest of his horde would move past these sites, the aroma in the air would call on the plague ogres in his army. Starving and battle-hungry, the smell of freshly cooked meat all but twisted their minds to seek out battle and eat their foes. It should be noted that this pass was extremely narrow, and the army had to travel in a very large column. They would experience and see some truly wondrous pieces of dwarven art, long lost to the ravages of time. As the horde was fully in the pass so they could not easily back out, they would make their first contact with the night goblins. At first it was not serious, minor pot shots, most of them missing, but as time would pass, the shots that landed their mark would begin to add up. Not only in body count, but it would begin to teeter the morale of the horde. Tamurkhan would allow his forces to hunt the night goblin wretches, but by the time they would get there, the night goblins in their positions, they would be gone. Met with only laughter and sneering as little pebbles would fall from the rocks. This infuriated the marauder tribes as they felt powerless in destroying this nuisance. What were they to do? Just continue walking and hope they make it to the end? These warriors would walk from sunup to sundown as they looked for an opening where it would be safe to camp. As Tamurkhan consulted his ancient map, he would see a wide opening ahead and decided he and his horde would make camp there. However, be it fate or the ire of the gods, there would be a change of plans. As Tamurkhan approached the opening, he would be met with a massive night goblin horde. They stood at the end of the pass with their glowing red eyes and banners waving in the wind. Tamurkhan took in his situation. He knew night goblins were cowardly. He also knew that they had a good estimation of his horde, so for them to meet like this and challenge his army, they had to think they could win. Tamurkhan sent up a Lord of Chaos on Dragon to scout the skies and report back. As he did this, he called for his lieutenant so he could take counsel. Noticing the night goblins were waiting for him to initiate the attack, Tamurkhan began to bellow orders from his throaty, rotten ogre's mouth. Just as Kazak the Befouled had gotten to the front and Sal the Faithless was in the middle of the column, the unexpected happened. His plague ogres, driven by battle lust and hunger, slipped the leash. So too did the warhounds and a few marauder tribes that were fed up with the potshots. And so it was, Tamurkhan was left with but one decision: to sound the charge. The night goblins were momentarily stunned and would have broken if they weren't packed so tightly together. As Tamurkhan's forces drew near, night goblins would begin to loose their arrows, mostly missing their mark. And then suddenly, amidst their ranks, war machines known as Doom Diver catapults, a contraption that would launch a goblin in the air in the hopes that the goblin would use its glider to fly into a target. These contraptions would begin to open fire. However, it should also be noted that these also had a very, very low success rate. With this artillery and fire superiority, little would be done to stave off Tamurkhan's horde. And as they made impact with the night goblin forces, they let loose a shrill of fear that would ripple through the night goblin ranks. Tamurkhan and Bublos would make contact as well, ripping into the enemy lines and cleaving apart its victims. Tamurkhan was no fool. He knew this was a trap, and so therefore, he was not surprised when the ground began to shake and the great dwarven pillars would collapse, breaking his horde up into sections. As Sal began to make his way to Tamurkhan, he would feel the very ground shake, and would find himself being thrown to his hands and knees. As he would look up, he would see the pillars crushing hundreds of warriors, and could only assume this scenario played out throughout the entire horde. As he began to bring himself to his feet, he started to gather the winds of magic to his side. He found himself with a formation of chaos dwarves, and saw that their discipline and martial prowess was unaffected by these random turns of events. They had formed a defensive triangle consisting of 3 separate formations of dwarves. With their iron demon war machine preparing for war, they waited for the ambush to occur. Sal had heard rumors of dwarves and their invisible doors, something that the chaos dwarves were all too familiar with themselves, and without missing a beat, these doors would open, and out would pour the night goblins. But beside the night goblins were big lumbering creatures with yellow eyes. Sal would call stone trolls. As soon as these doors opened, the Chaos Dwarves wasted no time in firing their weapons, being sure that these goblins knew they were not their weaker kin. However, the trap was a good one and properly set, so there was not much of a gap that the attackers had to close to be on them. The goblins did an awful job at laying low a Chaos Dwarf, for their armor was mostly interlocking and left very little spaces for them to be struck, save for the eye slits. The trolls, however, made for a more brutal combatant, and they would wreak havoc. Sal saw the trolls taking their toll on the Chaos Dwarves and started blasting the battlefield with sorcerous magic, flensing the skin from their very bones. The night goblins, however, would respond with another beast, and this was a giant cave squig. Sal looked at it in amazement. He had never laid eyes on a beast of this magnitude. Such wonders he'd seen on this journey. The giant squigs would attack and destroy a third of the defense triangle before an ironclad demon war machine would blast one to bits. The other giant squig, seeing this, made his charge towards the war machine, and Sal knew that they could not reload fast enough. So Sal was left with two options: try to flee, or harness all his power to slay the beast and spend his life force doing so. He cursed Tamurkhan for his pride and hubris. If it wasn't for him, they wouldn't be here, in this mess in the first place. Sal told him the omens were bad. As Sal began to harness the winds, he thought to himself, what a fitting end for me. Such a twist in my life. The one time I choose to not be selfish. The winds pulled and wrapped around him, but just as he almost was ready, the giant squig collided with the Iron Demon, and it exploded in a rush of demonic fire. Sal was thrown back. He tried to hold the winds of magic, but it was all for naught, and fire would wash over Sal's body. Tamurkhan's battlefield was faring a bit better. He too had encountered the trolls, but his own bile trolls were there to counter that. And not to mention, he would meet with the Night Goblin war boss, who rode atop a giant spider. He would chop off one of the spider's legs and force that war boss to flee. And with this, his army tried to retreat as well. The goblin boss would get away, but the army was not so lucky. They would find themselves pinned between the rock wall and Tamurkhan's forces, and subsequently be slaughtered. As the battle ended, Tamurkhan would have to make a review of his forces. First, he needed to access them. Tamurkhan would call out orders to his ogres, giants, and marauders to remove the rubble. However, a majority of his army no longer wanted to serve Tamurkhan. He was riddled with incompetence as a leader, and utterly uninspiring to those not of Nurgle's touch. His followers received no glory, and were constantly getting the short end of the stick. Now, after everything, he wants to treat them as slave labor, and have them remove stone. That was a result of his trigger of a trap that he knew was there. It was his forces of Nurgle that got them stuck in this position, his people that launched a disordered charge, because they themselves did not care for his word as a general. Tamurkhan would stifle any dissent and enforce his rule now through fear. He cared little for their ravings. He was there for the throne, and it was in his grasp. He would spend every single soul in his horde if it meant that he got to sit atop this throne. After a full month, Tamurkhan dug his forces out, only to find the ravages of war have taken their toll. Some pockets were entirely empty, where his forces had been killed to the man and their bodies dragged off to be eaten. This added only further dissent amongst those not given to Nurgle's blessings. However, they would regain their composure as an army and move on. Time was still of the essence, and Tamurkhan had an empire to topple. After consolidation and moving north out of the Winter's Tooth Pass, Tamurkhan had dispatched a few raiding parties to test and gain information on the capabilities of the Empire. All black powder weapons were handed to the Chaos Dwarves to inspect, and prisoners would be captured, tortured, interrogated, and if they died, the Dolgan shamans would bind their souls and continue interrogating them. Really makes you think if surrendering's an option. After some time at doing this, Sale, crippled, was able to draw up a map on some skin, as one typically does, I guess if there isn't any paper. He brings it to Tamurkhan and his war council. During this council, Tamurkhan and his generals see the city of Nuln. It should be noted that Sale was spoken over many times by the council, and Drazoth saw this and kept his counsel to himself. Tamurkhan devised a plan. He will make a three-pronged assault. Sale and his mammoths and Dolgans will go up the west. Chaos Dwarves will take the plains along with their war machines to travel, and Tamurkhan would take the roiling hills. As the advance would go underway, they would crush multiple towns and cities of the Empire. Nothing could even hold out. It was said neither high walls nor sharp steel could repel such a vast horde. And after 21 days, the horde would reach its destination, a white-towered city with walls so high that giants couldn't even reach. Tamurkhan would, as he has done so many times before, survey the battlefield. After crushing multiple cities of the Empire and hearing stories from other warlords, he would know that their capabilities were lethal. Their great cannons and black powder weapons had laid low other armies before his. He saw those very same cannons on their walls and made sure to stay just out of range. By the blessing of the gods, his horde was surrounded by a fog, so his enemy would have no way of knowing just how strong his army was. The Empire, however, was familiar in the way of the forces of chaos and the men of the North, and how they conducted war. So they expected to see them throw themselves at their walls, and in doing so they would gun them down as they attempted to close the gap between them and the fortress. What they didn't expect, however, was the Chaos Dwarves. Tamurkhan looked to Drazhoth and said, "Can you bring down these walls?" To which Drazhoth responded, "Walls? I see only piles of sand crafted by children. Bring my brothers close enough and we shall take pleasure in fulfilling our bargain and topple them for you." So Tamurkhan got as close as possible while staying out of reach of the Empire artillery, lifted up his black cleaver, and dropped it. The opening of war would begin. With a cacophony of booms and earth-shaking explosions, the Chaos Dwarf artillery pounded the Empire walls to dust, disintegrating human bodies in a flash of blinding light. Tamurkhan made no effort to advance, displaying his own firepower to these weak humans. Helpless as they were, the Empire soldiers knew they were going to die, and bravely chose to meet their end on their own terms. The Knights of the Empire charged out of the gap in the walls, experiencing for themselves what it was like to be pounded and shelled into oblivion. As Tamurkhan saw this, he sent his own knights out to meet with them, and in a short scuffle, the Empire Knights were stifled out. Tamurkhan now called for the advance. Plague ogres, siege giants, and bile trolls assailed the walls of men, while chaos dragons and manticores ripped cannons and men from their posts. Tamurkhan, so eager for glory, crashed into the lines of men, stomping down friend and foe alike. As the forces of chaos breached the heart of the city, and they killed the remainder of the defenses, they went through and plundered everything. However, there was something off. All the civilians were gone, and Tamurkhan thought to himself, such weak people, they deserve nothing but death and enslavement. How must they think they're so good to allow their warriors to die in their stead, while they cower? As nighttime drew on, Tamurkhan found the Temple of Sigmar, the same one from his dream, and made his way to the altar. He defaced this building and called out to his gods, offering up the city Nuln, in hopes this was deserving of his ascension. However, the gods were silent. Tamurkhan, confused, asked Sail what was wrong. Why had the gods not answered him? Had he not done their bidding to the letter? All Sail did was hold up an amulet of a twin-tailed comet. Tamurkhan, tired of riddles, rushed to Sail to cut him down, but Sail did not waver, and that threw Tamurkhan off. Finally, he took the amulet and held it up to his milky cataract eye, and read the word, Pfeiffeldorf. Tamurkhan, in a rage, would order Drazhoth to level the entire city, and he would do so gladly. Tamurkhan would then go to the Temple of Sigmar, gather up all the dead he could, and go into prayer. During this time of prayer, which spanned a few weeks, the Chaos Dwarves needed to speak with Tamurkhan. They were irate. They wasted munitions, time, and men on the wrong target, and wanted compensation. And yet again, Sail had to step up to the plate. Sail would turn them loose on a nearby town, where Drazhoth would conquer, rebuild, enslave its human population to his bidding, and use it as a hub to rest and refit. Others of Tamurkhan's horde were even more embittered. Tamurkhan was made to look like a fool by the fate of his gods. How could he have sieged the wrong city? After everything. After the Winter's Tooth Pass. After the Red Fist Tribe. After Zanbai Jin. How was he so incompetent, but still chosen by the gods? A series of infighting would take place. Sail would mostly try to keep some of these people in check. However, Tamurkhan would remain too busy in his prayers to concern himself with his horde. It wasn't until an assassin tried to claim Tamurkhan's life that he would break from prayer and readdress his horde. Now, it was time to make a move on Nuln. Over in Nuln, the city Tamurkhan meant to destroy, the Countess Emanuelle von Leibwitz held a council. Now, before we get into the council, allow me to introduce you to the Countess advisor, Elif von Draken, called the Dark Lady of Nuln and the Graveyard Rose. She is a magistrix of the Amethyst Order, respected advisor to Elector Countess Emanuelle von Leibwitz. She also was notorious for riding atop a carmine dragon for a mount. It is said that she's bent this beast to her will using her magic alone. Now during this council, it was one thing after another. What started off as a warning from Litpold the Black soon became a first-hand accounts from people within the province of Wissenland. The Countess was concerned about three things: the size of the horde, the speed at which it moved, and its unpredictability. Upon learning from Litpold the Black a horde of some capacity had ravaged the border princes, reinforcements were ordered to go out by Blackfire Pass, where they had expected that horde to show up. However, they would later hear how the horde instead came out the Winter's Tooth Crossing and had already begun to pillage every settlement. The Countess would go on to order any cities, towns, settlements to make its way back to Nuln and prepare to drop a battle plan to stave off a massive invasion. However, Olger Hawk, the general who commanded the armies of Feifeldorf, chose to evacuate his people but defend his city. Feifeldorf was the capital of Wissenland, and he would not give it up without a fight. So it was that he and 4,000 of his men would lose their lives to Tamurkhan's forces. However, his death was not in vain, for the Countess now had a grasp of Tamurkhan's strategy, capabilities, and size, all of which were unknowns. The Chaos Dwarf siege engines would not go unnoticed by the Countess this go-around. With this information, the Council devised a plan to thwart the largest invasion that Nuln has seen in generations. And to prepare for war, the Countess would honor her motto: "I'd rather be poor and alive than dead and rich." So she took to recruiting everyone she could. The Church of Sigmar answered without question or payment, knowing that it was their duty to face down this arch-fiend. They would take to the street corners, riling up townsfolk into a fervor. Any citizen caught doing any type of crime, minor or major, found themselves drafted, and the Countess would go on to hire a dozen mercenary warbands. However, people began to whisper dissenting things, saying the Countess has become feeble in mind due to her age and her ability to spend all of Nuln's coffers. Emanuela did not like this. These sentiments were harmful to morale, and she had a war to win, so she sent her champion Theodore Bruckner to chop their heads off and send a message. The message was indeed well received, and the dissension was gone, if not reduced to whispers. And with that taken care of, the Countess would plan her war. Tamurkhan and his forces arrived at the city of Nuln. In front of his army, Tamurkhan and Bubalo stood. To his left and to his right were the forces of Nurgle, those most loyal to him. Behind him were the hordes of other warriors, just far enough back so they wouldn't get sick from the rot and pestilence surrounding Tamurkhan and those of Nurgle. On the left flank rode Sail, atop a scarred war mammoth, and alongside him were Chaos Knights, Kurgan Marauders, and only a dozen war mammoths. Many of these war mammoths had perished from previous wars or the journey itself. These men that followed Sal no longer looked to Tamurkhan for leadership. They instead owed their allegiance to Sail. Just as you would think things couldn't get worse, up the middle of these two forces comes Drazoth and his Chaos Dwarves with their engines of death. The Countess, wise, saw this coming and strategized her warriors to be outside the walls so they could apply pressure to the war machines, keeping them out of range of their walls. This also served to be able to help them to maneuver in open ground rather than be congested behind the city walls, waiting for death. Ellis von Draken had a private discussion with Theodore Bruckner, where she gifted him an amulet of protection to keep him safe from foul magic, and told him his mission. His mission was simple, but also hard. He was to seek out Tamurkhan and slay him. The battle that was about to take place was nothing short of horrendous. As Tamurkhan unleashed its vanguard, the forces of Nuln would respond in kind with its cannon fire, ripping apart bile trolls and blasting marauders to pieces. Sal, atop his war mammoth, would unleash sorcerous bolts of energy like an angry god stomping down those beneath him. The Empire and the First Rank would begin to discharge their handguns, punching through armor and laying low those forces of the Dark Gods. The Empire's unrelenting gunpowder was keeping those very forces at bay. Well, that was, until the Chaos Dwarves showed up and decided to launch a sun into their front line. A bright red orb fell from the sky, and with a whoosh of explosion, the front rank was gone. And that would announce Drazoth. As rockets flew through the sky and cannons burst from the lines of Nuln, casualties would mount in such numbers unseen by both Tamurkhan and the Countess. Tamurkhan would call forth his knights to lead a charge on the main lines, and Kazak would be in the front with his Rot Knights. The Empire would let loose their crossbows and handguns, some finding their mark, others bouncing out the thick plate. And as Tamurkhan's knights rode on, victory swelled in their chests. They could taste the satisfaction of cutting down the men of Nuln. But last minute, the halberdiers of Nuln would step aside, showing their Hellblaster volley guns, and would let loose a volley of fire that would send riders and mounts alike crashing to the floor. But the charge was in motion, and it could not stop. And it wouldn't stop, not even if there was a god to stop them. Nothing would spare this unit from its destruction. As the knights clashed into the forces of Nuln, Tamurkhan would lunge out with Bublos, belching toxicity, melting those unlucky enough to find themselves in its vicinity. As the fighting went on, the Empire cannons began to silence, the Chaos Dwarves seemingly gaining fire superiority. On the flank, it seemed Sal had achieved victory. All he had to do was round his forces and flank the center lines with his men. That was, until floating pontoons went down the river and began hurling mortars and arrows at the Dolgans. Sal tried to rally his people and get them out of range, but some of them thought they could take on the floating gun batteries and were laid low. Sal, frustrated, finally got some order to his people, although now time was wasted. The Empire was able to set up a line to intercept his army. As Sal declared this charge, the Empire opened up with gunfire, laying low beasts, warriors, and mammoths, all in a hail of bullets. Sale would too be hit in the helmet, toppling insensible from his throne, and the war mammoths were all laid low, and with this the Kurgan and Dolgan people broke. All while this was taking place, the Chaos Dwarves were preparing to move to a more advantageous position, to either 1, attack, and also 2, be able to flee. That was, until they were hit in the rear by a unit of knights and Marienburg landships. These Marienburg landships opened fire, devastating the ranks of Chaos Dwarves, and Lord Drazhoth was quick to bark commands. But it was too late. The Empire was closing the gap fast. Faster than expected, and these landships were fast at shooting and moving. The Chaos Dwarves, who had already prepped the artillery for transport, frantically tried to ready them for use, but were assailed by gunfire from these ships. As the Chaos Dwarves got their bearing, they would utterly decimate this contingent, routing the Empire forces and leaving only one of the 10 ships to flee. Drawing back to the main battle, Tamurkhan was doing well, but was wondering where his Dolgan counterparts were. And when he looked over, he would see the death that racked the land. He would then hear of their flight, and in the rear, looking back, the Chaos Dwarves made their way from the battlefield too, having lost way more than they were willing to spend on Tamurkhan's fool's errand. Tamurkhan was livid. To make things worse, he was about to be charged by some very shiny knights. Now that Tamurkhan was on the receiving end of being charged, he would get the opportunity to experience what he had done to so many others time and time again. This charge, although killing hundreds of beastmen and marauders, wouldn't break Tamurkhan's line or his men. Instead, it more or less evened out the fight. Sorcerer's bolts would be let loose from the Empire's side, and Bublos' knee would take a severe hit, burning it to the bone. As twilight drew near, Tamurkhan and his forces would break contact with the Empire, and at this point, the Empire was too tired to give chase. Tamurkhan would meet with Kazak and instruct him to hunt down those that betrayed him, and so did Kazak. He would catch up to the Chaos Dwarves and slay them, as well as hunt down what he could of the Kurgan and Dolgan horsemen. To further sever his ties with his life as a mortal, he slit the throat of Bublos, draining all manner of toxins into the land. Then finally, Tamurkhan would take to the river, where he would allow his rot to fester and contaminate the nearby water. It should be noted that at this point, the ogre body is completely rotted. His voice no longer works, entrails are now dragging behind him, and he needs a new body to inhabit. As the waters began to fester and froth, it would turn into a gateway of some sort to allow demons of Nurgles to pour forth and gain a foothold on the land of Nuln. The Countess, being made aware of this, dispatched Theodore Bruckner and the knights from random orders to the Abbey of Lilies, where all this chaos was taking place. Ellis von Draken would join atop her Carmine Dragon. Once the forces of Nuln made contact with the forces of Tamurkhan, time was finite. They had to find Tamurkhan and kill him before any more demons could come through. Warrior priests fought and died alongside knights of Nuln. Demons would be flensed with holy fire, and Theodore Bruckner would barrel through atop his demigryph called Reaper. Together they would cleave their way through demons, making their way to Tamurkhan. Theodore would bellow a challenge, and Tamurkhan would grab his black cleaver, fed up with everything, and charge, with bones grinding and skin flopping about. Reaper would lunge at Tamurkhan, ripping apart his skin and tearing off his head. Shortly after Tamurkhan had his head ripped off, he would bury his cleaver in Reaper's chest, killing the beast outright. Theodore would be able to jump off, gaining purchase, and began to attack Tamurkhan with his enchanted blade. Every cut rent would pour out filth and decay. Theodore, gagging, took a step back and slid in the slop that was once Bublos. Tamurkhan, seeing his moment, pounced, chewing through bone and leather, started his usual process. Then an explosion would occur. The talisman around Bruckner's neck would detonate, destroying Theodore, Tamurkhan, and the Abbey of the Lilies. Alice von Draken was able to see her plan play out. The demons of chaos would lose their foothold in this reality and fizzle from existence. However, with the Abbey of the Lilies being destroyed, her Carmine dragon would die and fall to the ground, and as for Alice von Draken, she would wither into shadow. With Tamurkhan's reign over and the forces of chaos dispersed, we're left wondering how any of this came to be written down. Well, allow me to quote the book. "And what of I, his chronicler? Blinded by burning metal, abandoned and scorned by my people. I who had risen so high, whom men called faithless, was left a beggar upon the road of desolate. Condemned by the dark gods to black penance, a stranger in a strange land, but far from helpless. And soon, my story will be told." Well, there you have it. That's Tamurkhan. Holy cow, this... Woo! Oh, this story was a good one. I have to say, you could really see the creative writing in it. Honestly, I wish that Forge World or Games Workshop would release its books, like, again, because so much good lore is gone or just paywalled behind ridiculous prices on eBay. And again, this story was written by Alan Bly and Rick Presley, so really, really great writers, and it's really a shame, especially given how well written this story is. I hope that I was able to portray a good story through Tamurkhan, maybe give you a little bit more details. Let me know what you thought about the whole series. I'll probably be doing a series every month of something. And hey, I'll catch y'all on the flip side. Take care, everybody. Old World Books come on the 20th. I look forward to going through all of it with you. Peace.